So now let's discuss in some more depth some of the issues that we touched upon in the previous conversation. We know, most of you know, that there are many positive potential to blockchain technology. You're convinced of that. We are all convinced of that. And linked to it allowing centralization, automation, disintermediation. And we have always seen this characteristic at play in some blockchain-based products and services, enabling, for example, more direct and more inclusive economic and social linkages, enabling more efficient and speedy transactions, etc., etc. And while it has been said already, there are few blockchain users operating at truly commercial scale so far, adoption is growing steadily and across sectors. And I would say in spite of the recent crypto winter, as it was called. At the same time, these characteristics are often a double-edged sword because they create some of the most significant challenges in terms of governance to a responsible and trustworthy blockchain innovation. Decentralization, particularly in permissionless networks, means that identifying responsible actors is often difficult or sometimes impossible. And this opens the door to poor conduct, such as the scams that we have seen, ICO scams, the problem of theft of digital assets, etc. And also, of course, ongoing concerns regarding tax evasion or money laundering. We have been told about the recent OECD recommendation on blockchain and other DLTs. We were told what are the main pillars, the main recommendations regarding compliance, coherence, transparency, disclosure around the governance of networks and products and services, etc. Also, like this recommendation calling for appropriate mechanisms on digital security, on privacy, personal data, etc. So experience shows, and we know that very well at the OECD, that new rules, new guidelines that we are developing very often, usually they galvanize, innovation to create solutions. And we can see that in the area of what we are talking about today with the proliferation of RegTech solutions following the crypto asset, virtual asset recommendations of the FATF. So this panel now will explore how blockchain actors can reflect these expectations in their product design and in their operations, and also we would like to discuss what governments can do to encourage their implementation. We have a really fantastic panel, people that know much more than me, that's why I'm the moderator only, about all of these questions. We have Laurence Wintermeyer, the chair of the Global Blockchain Business Council. Thanks for joining us, Laurence. We have Primavera de Filippi, a researcher at CERSA and research fellow at Berkman-Klein Center at Harvard University. Thanks for joining us, Primavera. We have Nadia Filali, who is the head of blockchain and crypto assets at the Caisse des Dépôts here in Paris. And last but not least, Caroline Malcolm, a former colleague of us who was in charge of this blockchain forum in previous years, and who is now the head of international public policy and research at Chain Analysis. So, I will ask all of you a first question. From your own work, what challenges do you see in building trust and confidence in decentralized markets? And how much is coming from the private sector and how much is up to governments? So maybe Laurence first.
Thank you very much. And it's a privilege to be here. And it's so great to be back in person and catch up with so many great friends. So thank you. I chair an industry members association that focuses on digital assets and crypto standards and education. We have over 500 corporate members. And ultimately, we are focused on making sure that we have the right proportional regulation for crypto and digital assets. And we call it the right size regulation. But we do that through developing standards with regulators in what we would call a co-regulatory model and under purview. So I'd first like to leave you with the impression that there's a great degree of regulatory and policymaker engagement going on in the industry. There has been, really, on my watch for the last 6 or 7 years. But this is as we all appreciate, I think a social and anthropologically complex area, because digital is borderless, and digital is moving quicker than most of us can cope with. It's moving quicker than capitalists can cope with. It's moving quicker than institutions can cope with. And it is certainly moving quicker than governments, policymakers, and laws can keep up with. And it isn't just in blockchain. We could be speaking about AI, any aspect of technology manufacturing. And it isn't one particular government or issue. It's not a G20 issue. It is a global issue. So I think, again, the importance of these convening forums is just to recognize we have, a great social challenge here. So I want to pick up a couple of points, particularly around this discussion about DeFi. And I think what we would say is that decentralization or centralization is often misunderstood, as is blockchain, as is Bitcoin. In deference to previous comments, nowhere in Satoshi's white paper does anybody talk about creating a system that is going to work outside of central governments or central banks. It's an elegant white paper which I think should be a Nobel Prize, Economic Prize candidature for using technology and distributed ledger technology as a payment mechanism or a store of value and avoiding double counting. It's 7 pages. It's the most elegant thing you could read. And nowhere in it is a great political manifesto. So I need to remind everyone that quite often the narratives we repeat are things we may hear in the media or from people reflect one voice of the community, but don't necessarily reflect the broad community. Just as somebody speaking from either side of democracy may say something that is incendiary to you that you don't agree with, that is democracy. It doesn't reflect democracy as a whole. So we're very active in standards. I would say that the biggest issue is at the policy level, and I love Carmina's view of we need a new Bretton Woods for digital finance. That is pretty much, I would say, one of our bigger asks in a G20 context, which is we really need to coordinate this much better at a macro level. But at a bottom-up level, the industry is working, and capital, in a networked digital way, is working much quicker than most people can. And so our guidance and most of our community are focused on really a 2-track approach to things. The first track is recognizing that even though we have a lot of change and we have a lot of questions we might need to answer, some of them almost existential about these technologies, we have standards for a number of things. I am pleased to have been invited onto the BPAB and the advisory group by Carolyn for the blockchain and DLT policies that the OECD released last year, so congratulations on that. The OECD has standards and principles for AI. IOSCO has standards and principles for high-frequency trading. Wholesale markets have standards for leverage lending. We have standards, broadly for data service and provision. So for most of the constituent pieces of the decentralized finance community, we already have standards that do, well, not mentioning the AML, KYC standards, et cetera. So we already do have standards, and as a transition, the industry is focused on how we can adopt those standards and move to them. I think most importantly, and to your question, Mathilde, moving forward, unless policy makers and regulators really get engaged in digital technology, and so our favorite term in our community is RegDAO, and we were very much inspired by Primavera. I had the privilege of opening a panel last year with who's a specialist on this. Until governments really get on-chain and regulators on-chain and start participating, even in a passive way, not necessarily an active way, but getting engaged in co-reg models with industry to make sure that from a RegTech or SubTech perspective, they've got oversight, They understand how the economics and incentives of particular digital communities happen. Until that happens, I don't think we're necessarily going to make any massive breakthroughs. So I think that would be our perspective of where things are right now, and certainly what our very large and diverse global community is advocating.
Thank you, Laurence. Very clear message to governments. Now I would like to turn to Caroline. How do you see the main challenge?
Thanks, Mathilde. I guess it's really three things I want to mention. The first is, one of the biggest challenges, it's been a challenge in this industry for a long time, is sort of myths and misconceptions. There's no question that there are scams, there are significant hacks. We're talking very significant sums of money in this space, and for very obvious reasons, they capture lots of the headlines. That's what a lot of the sort of chatter in a lot of the sort of mainstream and even the sort of mainstream financial press are as well. And at Chainalysis, that is a lot of what we do, is tracking that sorts of illicit activity, understanding the nature of activity, using tools to investigate that activity and so forth. And at the same time, and to sort of echo something that Laurence was saying, this is something which is not just less than 1%, but about 0.15% of the transactions that take place on the blockchain. So, and that's not to minimise the importance of tackling that issue. These are very large sums of money. They're very significant amounts of individuals' life savings and so on and so forth. So it's not at all to minimise it. But it is to put back into context what we're actually dealing with here, and to recognise that, in a lot of these conversations that we often hear, that those facts can actually get misrepresented and brought out of context. And I think even in terms of thinking about, the future or even the current state of this space, we are still hearing a lot of messages about, well, we don't necessarily see this ever happening, a single cross-border settlement token. And for people in this space, they're already living in that world. That's something that already exists. So the idea that that's not a world that will happen in the future is really sort of disentangled from what's actually already the case. Maybe not in our formal institutions, but it is still very much there already in the market. So I think it's important to kind of remember not just sort of like what's possible in the future, but kind of keep educated, and that's part of the industry's role as well, about the reality of where we already are today, and also, what's going to be happening in the future, because I think there's an increasingly sort of clear trajectory. If we think about a lot of what's happened in the space, and a lot of the hype around crypto, it does take up a lot of noise. But if we think about the kind of the first era of fintech as being very focused on the retail focus, the kind of front end of finance, that kind of consumer-facing front, this is really focused much more on the back end, and so a much more fundamental shift in the plumbing of the international financial system is going to take place. So we already thought fintech was very disruptive, and this is really the kind of second era of that, and is going to be even more so than what we've seen so far. So I think that sort of first point about understanding, sort of battling through the myths and misconceptions in this space. The second issue is really, and you touched on it, Mathilde, is around the sort of regtech and subtech and sort of innovation that needs to occur just as much in the regulatory and policy space as we see as happening in industry as well. And I often think about the fact that for industry, we often, in governments, they often create a space, almost a safe harbour, regulatory sandbox, where that innovation can take place within some safeguards, within some protection, almost in a partnership type way. Today, governments don't really have the luxury of that same approach, that luxury of innovation and being able to try out new approaches and not be immediately concerned about, the effect of a particular rating or so on and so forth, or how the, international community will see those efforts. And I think that could be a very important sort of step forward in allowing, beyond the crypto space, but certainly that, given that's what we're focused on today, but really thinking about how we can incite more policy innovation and more investment in regtech and subtech, because we're just not at the levels that we see in terms of innovation in the space generally. And thirdly, just digging onto DeFi specifically, I think the kind of the key question that's being grappled with right now is, what does decentralization mean? And I think the greatest challenge is that for industry, it's often referred to as something which really relates more to access. So how you access into those markets, do you have to go through an intermediary or not? And when governments think about it, they think about it much more from the perspective of, well, who's got control? So it's this governance question. And I think those are two quite different perspectives, and it's why conversations are so important, because we're not really talking the same language when we talk about DeFi so far.
Thank you, Caroline. Now, Nadia, what do you see as the main challenges?
So really pleased also to be there with you and to come back to OECD from, I think, for 3 years now, something like this. And so I'm Nadia Filali, I'm head of blockchain and crypto asset in Caisse des Dépôts. And Caisse des Dépôts, it's a very old house. It's a public financial group in France working in the finance space to finance some economic development, particularly in region, but we are working also in transportation with Transdev, we are working in insurance with La CNP, we are also working in area like having in our capital, in our portfolio, the French Post, for example, for 1 year now. And we began to work on blockchain and crypto assets in 2015. So it was a challenge in itself for our institution. And as we are a particular institution and very traditional institution, working on this kind of innovation was not very easy, and it's not really easy every day. And I think one of the challenges that we find there in this institution, it's also the challenges that perhaps all of you have to manage. The first one, and I think Caroline, she talked a little about that, it's that we need to educate all our partners, all our collaborators, all the employees, for also to explain what is it and what is it not also. Because there is a lot of buzzes on things, and we need to explain that. So with the program, we are doing this job inside the group Caisse des Dépôts, from the COMEX to all the people in the group. And after that, one of the challenges, when you understand what is it or not, you need also to work on it concretely. So in the beginning, we just began as experimentation, doing POCs, etc. But you cannot continue like this because we are also managing by performance and the revenue. And one of the points is how to find how to work on the concrete business cases that you can develop and where there is a business model. And it's not really easy on this technology because we are in the beginning of something that is moving very quickly. So you always need to adapt what you are doing, looking at the new things, and also work with the regulators, with the evolution of the regulation also, but not only, working also on the technical approach, because this is about technology in the first thing. So in Caisse des Dépôts, we work on all these topics. And what we do, we work in different areas. The first one is finance, because we are a finance institution, but we work also on the question of identity and SSI, and we launched a company on that with some partners named Archipel. We work in collaboration with startups and all the ecosystem in finance through a consortia named LabChain, for example. And we also work with the regulator, and particularly also with the European Commission. And we are, I'm in Caisse des Dépôts, but I also the chair of the board of director of INATBA, International Association for Trusted Blockchain Application, an association who was launched with the support of the European Commission. I think it was important, and it's important for us and even for Caisse des Dépôts to discuss together and work together each part of the ecosystem: startups, regulators, investors, corporates, and it's really important as a challenge to work really together. I think it's one of the aim thing that we do from the beginning here. It's that blockchain and crypto asset, it's complex, it's fractal, it's a little humid for the moment. We don't know where we are going. And so you cannot say, okay, I will develop my business and I will do it myself. It's not true. It's decentralized technology. So you need to work with others, and you need to find to work on the value proposition and share with other partners. You need also to work with the regulator to find an equilibrium between regulation, because I think regulation is important. We cannot do things like this. And also how to let the innovation going on. I think we saw that in France and in Europe, and we saw the last thing go on MiCA. It's very important in France. Before we work on La Loi Pacte with the status of PSAN, and I think the things are going on very in a good way. So it's important to work on that together. And for example, and to have a more operational challenges, Caisse des Dépôts is PSAN as a custody now from 1 year. And I don't know if you imagine what happened when you ask your top management to see. We'll ask for an agreement, for IMF agreement for PSAN for the custody for our client. And it's specific clients in Caisse des Dépôts, public one, and you call your compliance, you call the risk entity, and you said, hey, we'll work on crypto. Really, it's difficult. It's difficult because it's not the way that they saw the things. It's difficult because you try to work on KYC and AML, and when you explain that you cannot identify the party like this, you can do your KYC, you can do part of KYC, but you cannot just apply what you are doing in traditional finance. It's not true. So there is really operational challenges. The first point is going to try to educate the people and all your partners. The second point, I think, is really to work together. And the third point is to try, but try concretely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. So now, Primavera, I understood you will talk about some interesting DAO projects. So please educate us.
Yes. So thank you again. I'm very pleased to be here. So I am first and foremost a researcher. So I'm a researcher at the CNRS here in Paris and at Harvard. And it's been now since 2013 that I decided to focus all of my academic research on the legal questions of blockchain technologies. So obviously I've seen the space evolve. I published a book on blockchain and the law in 2018. And interestingly enough, I think that things have changed, but actually not that much, in the sense that there is still these important challenges of legal uncertainty, which is somehow preventing adoption at the institutional level of those technologies. And so I'm currently working on ERC, European-funded project that is specifically geared towards analyzing the interplay between trust and confidence in the blockchain space. And the idea is kind of to move away a little bit from these initial conception of blockchain technology as being completely trustless, because what does it really mean to be trustless? And instead looking at the positive thing, what is it that blockchain technology actually provides? And it is confidence. And so moving away from blockchain as trustless system into blockchain as a confidence machine that provides some type of technological guarantees about how things will be executed. And the interesting thing is that ideally, of course, the more confidence one have, then the less trust is needed, because we don't need to delegate trust to a particular entity. We know that the system will work exactly as it has been codified. But of course, it is not possible to eliminate trust altogether. And in fact, we need a particular layer of trust in order to build confidence. And of course, this is very obvious in the context of blockchain-based network, where the only reason that we can be confident that things will operate in a particular manner is because we trust that the underlying governance of those networks is actually properly decentralized, and that no single actor can co-opt the whole system and therefore modify the history of the transactions. And so we have this notion of decentralization, and decentralization is extremely useful because it provides this distributed trust that creates technological guarantees and therefore confidence. But at the same time, decentralization also creates new trust problems, because all of a sudden a decentralized system can more easily be taken over or co-opted by specific entities because it is not protected by a particular entity. And so this is quite clear in the context of blockchain-based network, but it also applies at the higher level, at the layer 2 or at the smart contract level, where we do have a particular type of confidence and technological guarantees because of the codification into a particular smart contract. But at the same time, we also need to trust that code. We need to actually trust that the code is operating or has been conceived properly, that it will not break, that there are no bugs, that it is not a scam, or that it will be able to evolve as things change, as the environment is changing. And also, of course, that this code is somehow consonant and in line with existing legal rules. And so in some way, like, the confidence cannot exist without the trust in the governance and in the design of the code. And so I'm going now to the DAO model law. So it has been now about 3 years that we started this work on drafting a DAO model law, which present potential ways in which legislators around the world could provide some type of partial legal recognition or enabling DAOs to interface more easily into the existing legal system. And the thing is that, of course, there is increasingly problems within the DAO ecosystem, because it is not clear what type of liability do the DAO member might have, given that a DAO is not recognized and therefore might naturally be recognized as a general partnership. But also there is increasingly a demand from the DAOs to be able to interact and to interface with existing legal entity. They want to hire people, but what does it mean to be hired by something that is not a legal entity? And so the idea with the DAO model law was to try and provide ways and suggestions about how a particular legal framework for those new type of corporate entities, if we want to call them like this, could be made. And the interesting thing is that it also comes from the recognition that it's difficult, in fact, for regulator to dictate the way in which DAOs have to be designed because enforcement is complicated, right? And so instead, what we suggest is to rely on this notion of regulatory equivalence. And the idea is to provide specific criteria that should be fulfilled by DAOs in order to benefit from a particular degree of legal recognition. And so, of course, DAOs are completely free not to fulfill those requirements, but in that case, they will not benefit from the legal recognition that the regulators will give. Whereas if they actually choose to comply voluntarily with those design criteria, because they have been held to fulfill the similar objectives as existing requirements in corporate law, then the regulator might provide some kind of recognitions, might provide ways for those DAOs to interface and interact with the legal system. And in some way, it's kind of like it's a give-give approach, meaning that it's difficult for a regulator to say this is how those decentralized autonomous blockchain system should be designed, unless they give something in exchange, right? And so instead of using the stick, it's actually using the carrot and being like, well, here is what we have to offer. We have to offer the capacity to interface with the legal system. We offer reduced legal uncertainty in exchange that you also come towards us and you actually comply with those requirements that we think are legitimate equivalents to existing regulatory rules. And basically in terms of like what are the challenges and how can those challenges be tackled, I think that there is somehow, it's difficult today for regulators to really identify what is the right design because we are still in an exploratory phase at all levels. And so instead, it's really an invitation for from the public sector to the existing private actor in the blockchain space to experiment and to come up themselves with proposition about how they think that a particular technological solution and the technological guarantees that come with it can be held to be regulatory equivalent and come to the regulator, propose this solution, and then the regulator has to assess it. And if they consider it to be indeed equivalent, then they can provide some kind of legal recognition. If not, the private sector needs to search again. And in this way, there is this kind of collaboration that emerges where the innovative solution will obviously come from the private sector, but it needs to be endorsed and recognized by the public sector.
Thank you very much, Primavera. I think we have entered already the space of solutions here, and that's the focus of the second question. So I might repeat a little bit some of your broader things, but we see that DLTs basically they present alternative governance and compliance models that generally are not foreseen in the current policy settings or regulatory settings. But they might eventually, as your example showed, that they might eventually meet the intent of the regulation. So what are, to your views, all of you, some of the developing technologies or practices in this space that could, meet the intent of regulation or help having this convergence, I would say, or equivalence, as you mentioned, Primavera? And what are their limitations? So I don't know who wants to step in on this one first.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to start, and again, Primavera, thanks for that. Again, we're in the final stages of our IOSCO affiliate membership, which is important to GDF in that we would be the first crypto or digital assets organization as an affiliate member of IOSCO. And we've proposed exactly to IOSCO what Primavera has mooted, which is how can we assemble a community, and in fact, a lot of the technical service providers at the heart of the community who have the data to put you into a gov accelerator or a policy accelerator so that we can start collaborating and get regulators, I think, really educated but aware of the various structures, technical structures of how DAOs work. What I would say, Primavera, is, without getting into the regulatory details of things, we speak about functional equivalency rather than regulatory equivalency, mainly because regulatory equivalency looks like it will be difficult, in many jurisdictions. And functional equivalency right now, as we stand in the world, is fairly close between Europe and MiCA, which is really groundbreaking from our community perspective in the way that it treats its classification of crypto assets, which I won't bore you with, but leaves securities in their own swim lane. And in the US, where there's an increasing agreement that the CFTC will have purview of the crypto spot and cash derivatives market, and it's likely that stablecoins will go down an FDIC regulated or some sort of banking supervised route. So in those two areas, if we exclude securities, we've got a great degree of regulatory, functional equivalence to build on. And I think that that's very important to pay attention to. That's a positive development. On DAOs, I think it's important to mention as well, with Singapore leading the way and Australia, the Australian Treasury Department not too far behind, we're getting greater clarification on legal structures for DAOs. Whether you're into this or not, it needs to be some sort of mutual structure, which is really what a DAO is. It is a mutual structure. But, we're always saying to the community, whether it's, blockchain, the tokenization of digital assets, commodities, securities, equity, debt, derivatives, I don't know why anyone would think that in a democracy that you can do that outside of the law, whether it's common law or code law, and you need to pay attention to the laws. I think what we do recognize, and many of you would recognize, is that if we're going to solve the problems we have in society right now, with inflation running at the rate that it's running, energy crisis, the energy prices that we have, or food inflation, what we don't want to do is let innovation get regressed to the mean because we've got regulation that isn't suitable for it. And that's exactly where we are at this great point of convergence. It's a convergence of new technology with old technology and how suitable our democratic principles and laws are, and it's happening right now. So I think that actually is the Gordian knot of convergence that we're facing right now. So I just want to make a couple of very quick points on this. One, in the context of DAOs, if you look at them as mutuals and expect that we'll have legal clarification, I think actually in Europe as well, many countries are looking at this. Clearly the UK is looking at it. I'm not sure where the US is. It hasn't been a priority, but typically the US surprises us, and when we think they're not looking at something, pops up quickly, with a market for it. So I'd pay attention to this. But I think this area is very important to the context of digital assets, because people get overly focused on Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, and really digital assets. If you look at the size of the equity, debt, securities markets, commodities markets, and all of the traditional markets being tokenized, they are much larger than the cryptocurrency market. The most important thing, and the prevailing theme of this forum, is they have blockchain or distributed ledger technology sitting underneath them and enabling them. And why is that important? If we are going to move to Web3, whatever that may be, but let's assume at the point of consumption, whether we're consumers or businesses, we can transfer value around like we send emails, which is what people say, or have the protection of identity so that we're not bearing our details to 15 different institutions or different websites, but it's in a secure space that we choose who we want to share it with. For Web3 to deliver all of that, we need to improve the security and integrity of not just the infrastructure in technology, which today is totally poor. If you look at hacking rates, the issues around cybersecurity, whether you're a bank or a consumer, it is failing us. So Web 2 isn't capable of doing all of these things we're speaking about in DAOs, and we need something to deal with that. And we need to deal with the identity issue and disclosure of identity, which is at the heart of many of the things I think Primavera is speaking about in the context of DAOs. And so just one last point. The most important thing about blockchain and the public network is that it is a distribution of data with a cipher handshake, and it is the most secure thing on the planet. And back to Caroline's point about crime. When Bitcoin is stolen or bridges are hacked, it isn't actually on chain in this instance. It's because we're using Web 2 technologies to custody keys, to bridge things. And so I think that is the importance of this newer technology, which isn't that new. We've been dealing with it for 14 years now, so it's actually quite mature in many ways, although derivatives of it are popping up. And so With that sort of blockchain or DLT infrastructure, we should be assured if we can keep to the principles and keep it native, we do have something secure. I think quantum is the only thing that may actually threaten it, although I hope it would accelerate it. So I think bearing those points in mind, that we've got greater functional equivalence coming, we've got greater clarity on regulatory structures for DAOs, which I would encourage you to look at as mutual structures, which would involve legal identity and provenance in it. And we've got a very secure technical infrastructure broadly in the blockchain, mainly because of the node validation and how many different nodes have to validate what the transparency or legitimacy of a transaction is. We're actually a very good step forwards in solving some of these technical issues.
Thank you. So now, Caroline, what could you tell us about solutions, in the governance space?
Yeah, so I think this is quite interesting. I think what's clear from some of the ideas that the Primavera has put forth and some of the kind of market and regulatory developments we're starting to see in this space, and Lawrence, alluded to Singapore, for example, where we see Project Guardian, which is a sort of a new proposal based on sort of trusted nodes. If we think about it, to simplify the explanation, essentially, you have these sort of entry points into a DeFi universe, and you get checked at the gate to get into this DeFi universe, and then once you're in that universe, so you can operate and do as you wish. But you do have these kind of entry points, these KYC points where you do kind of get checked for entry. But what's clear in all of these, whether it be Project Guardian, some of these other DAO projects, is that it absolutely requires the public and private sector to work together. And therefore, that puts an onus on industry to develop solutions. And I think it's fair to say that in order for DeFi to grow to its full potential, regulation is a partner to that growth. And so there is a need to think about, and for the industry to think about, how do we meet, from not just sort of a legal perspective, but in terms of like our broader, society that we want to live in, how do we meet those kind of bare minimums that have been set, and also provide options that go beyond that for players who want to operate at sort of different levels of sort of regulation or comply with different countries' obligations. So there's an obligation on industry there, but there's also, there is also a need from the public sector to kind of engage in those discussions. And I think, like with all of us in many ways, there's always a bandwidth problem. There's not enough resources, whether that be time or money and so on and so forth. But the reality is in this space, the innovation, and I think this is where it's quite different because of its, distributed and decentralized often nature, you can't stop the innovation from occurring. So you always have a sort of a duty to keep up in order to actually meet the challenges in this space. And I think that is the sort of key takeaway there. And I think maybe just one other thing I would mention is that we often talk about the hacks and the scams and so forth. And I'm always brought back to a conversation I had a couple of years ago about, we would never send information using DLT because it's just not secure. And I just thought, wow, do you really think your current systems are that secure that you'll stick with that? And I think we are often asking, proofs of new technologies which we do not expect of our existing systems. And I think we have to be very realistic about where we actually are, which is that, this is a, cybersecurity is an issue which we are very much yet to solve. And so kind of looking at new approaches and criticizing for them, perhaps for, and as Lawrence says very accurately, it's not the blockchain that's being hacked in these cases, just to be very, very clear about that. And so really trying to think about, as a comparative approach too, that we are treating, we are kind of being objective in the criticisms that we bring, I think is also really important.
Thank you. Nadia, would you like to add something?
Yes. We know that blockchain and DLTs and crypto assets have some properties that could help in, I think, in the RegTech and in the regulation. We are talking here of transparency. We have technology to work on how to enforce the digital identity, and we saw that in Europe we are working on the e-wallet and the development of the SSI. We know also that we have a big auditability on the transaction, so that can help even in finance. That can help the regulator if you have a system distributed and you have all the transaction of all the banks and directly the information of the transaction, for example, on the OTCs could share with the regulator, it could be really interesting. So I think those technology could be a solution to enforce the RegTech and how to supervise the financial transaction. There is challenges in sustainability, in inclusion, in different things, but as Caroline said, there is a lot of innovation, and I think we cannot stop the machine, and I think it's important to understand. And me, when I'm talking about this technology, I said that it's a social protocol. Those technology appear in a moment in the world that is not neutral. People are looking for transparency, decentralization, more collaboration, circular economy, etc. And so we saw that, for example, in France, we are around 8% of the population having invested in crypto, and it's 46% of people less than 35 years old, and they have, in the majority, less than 18,000 pounds of euro of savings. So it's not neutral, and I think it's important to look at the point. After that, we are in a global world with a technology that the development is global. There is no frontier in blockchain and crypto, but we have different vision of the regulation, I think, and we can work in civil law or in common law, and I think it's not the same. So working on how to harmonize and articulate the regulation, I think is important. We work, for example, in ADBA, we launch a government advisory body on the different important subjects, like in finance. The finance, it's managing by ADGM in the UA, and also the European Commission is co-chair on this group, and we have identity in Canada, you have sustainability in South Africa, and it's important to work collectively on this subject of governance and regulation on that point, because everyone needs to understand what can support the technology and what you cannot just apply because it's not working, really. There is some constraint, there is some technological constraint, and how we can work together, because if you have a regulation in one part of I don't know, in UK and another part in Europe, and you have a transaction everywhere, I think it could be difficult. And if you need to share your identity or your attribute or your credential, it's the same, not only in finance. I think there is many subjects that could be work on globally. I think it will take time, because it will be difficult, and everyone wants to push his point of view. But really, I think it's an opportunity. We saw that in fintech in the beginning, the startups are using the lake of law in some points. We saw that the ecosystem launched some services and activities in crypto, but I think they are more working now with the regulator that we can saw before on the payment on fintech and other things. So it's a good view, and it's important to work on that, I think.
Thank you. Primavera, you want to add something
Yes.
on the solution?
Yes, I would like to draw a distinction, in fact, just so that we clarify and we know that we're on the same page in terms of vocabulary. And I would like to make a distinction between the notion of functional equivalence and regulatory equivalence, because I think it's a valuable distinction to have. And so functional equivalence, we all know it. It is when we have a new technology that is held to be functionally equivalent to a previous object that is regulated, and therefore bringing that new technology under the scope of existing regulation, so electronic contracts and so forth. Regulatory equivalence, I think, is slightly more subtle in the sense that it is more about well, given that now something is under a particular body of law, then is it possible to achieve the same regulatory or policy objective that a particular formality or regulatory burden require with a different means, with a different technology? And so perhaps like a broader way to define regulatory equivalence will be like purpose-driven regulation, right? Where what matters is the objective, and then there are many paths that can lead to that particular objectives. And so when you try to apply this to blockchain technology, I think it becomes very interesting, because while functional equivalence is a tool to be used in order to bring specific blockchain system into particular body of laws, regulatory equivalence is more about a tool of adopting blockchain technology as a RegTech technology and actually using it in order to achieve regulatory compliance. And so in terms of practical examples, perhaps, I think, well, the most obvious ones will be like using blockchain technology in order to facilitate auditings and real-time reporting and so forth, in a way that if I use a blockchain, then it is impossible for me to claim that a transaction that is recorded on the blockchain did not happen, or vice versa, that a transaction happened if it's not appearing on the blockchain. So all of a sudden, the requirement of audits becomes lessened, because the technology itself is providing this very secure audit trail. Same thing with perhaps like with multisig, which can be used as a mechanism for ensuring, for instance, like securitize expenditure of fundings in corporate settings. We have proof of reserve, which I think is very interesting, that cryptocurrency exchanges are using in order to prove through technological means that they actually have a full reserve without requiring, therefore, audits into the actual internal system. And then I think perhaps more avant-garde examples will be like in the context, for instance, of ICO. So ICO have been subject to functional equivalence in the sense that, well, they actually raise similar risk than an IPO, and to the extent that the risks are similar, then the regulation should also be similar. But at the same time, it is also possible, and I think this is something that has not been as explored as it could, it is possible to design specific token sales, specific smart contract, which will be specifically designed to reduce those risks. And if we manage to reduce the risk by contractual or by smart contractual means, by technical means, by providing new technological guarantees, then perhaps we are actually complying in a different manner, and therefore it might be possible to be less subject to the more draconian type of regulation. Same thing with DAOs, again, so perhaps through the traditional functional equivalence, a DAO will qualify naturally as a general partnership. What will be the specific technological design and technological guarantees that DAOs needs to adopt in order to be held functionally equivalent to some other type of corporate entities? And then, once we have this, then the question of regulatory compliance comes about, and therefore regulatory equivalence. And so, is it possible, for instance, to fulfill the registration requirement by deploying specific information on the blockchain which provides sufficient transparency? Is it possible, for instance, to implement on-chain mechanisms to fulfill requirements for corporate governance and so forth? And so all of a sudden there is this kind of interesting interplay between the functional equivalence which enable us to regulate things within a particular framework, and then within that, then adopting these purpose-driven regulation that enable those technological solutions to emerge, because it is actually extremely valuable to identify those technological solutions, because it enables to choose between, do we want to fulfill the traditional formalities, which can be very expensive, or do we want to adopt a particular technological infrastructure which achieve the same objective and which might tie the hands a little bit, but at the same time has much less cost.
Thank you. I think we had fantastic answers to this question of how to, meet the intent of regulation in a different way for different kind of objects, or I don't know, product services or systems. Let me go now. We have looked at the challenges. We have looked at some of the solutions and how, as you said, how the very characteristics of this technology could build up new solutions to the regulatory challenge. Could you tell us no more about what you see as emerging trends that would increase or decrease, these governance challenges? And what does this mean for policymakers? What shall governments do or international organizations do looking at these new emerging trends in the space?
Would you like me to start? Can I just start by saying, Primavera, I couldn't agree with you more. I must qualify. When I talk about regulatory equivalence, I'm talking about financial services. And, on one hand, we've got our friends at the IMF and many people talking about a global framework for crypto assets. From my perspective, regulatory equivalence in third parties looks like a long shot. I'm happy to be wrong. And my wife will tell you she always celebrates when I'm wrong because it happens quite often, which is a good thing. As a trader, normally I'm hedged, so I don't feel quite bad about that. But long live global regulatory equivalence in crypto. I think that's a bit far off, but we do live in hope. I think, what are the most important things policymakers need to focus on? I actually think this panel has done a fantastic job already in laying out some of the foundations that policymakers need to be thinking about, and trying to do some of the myths or bust some of the myths that people have about either, cryptocurrencies, the technology, or where things are going. And I just want to pick up a point that Caroline made, which, I always, in my community, I'm typically the adult in the room, which again is something my wife would argue vehemently about, but sitting in between innovators, regulators, and policymakers, having spent a career in broadly in private markets, mainly in advisory and in asset management and in hedge and structured products, those sort of things, which you find many people in the blockchain and digital assets communities and financial services are ex-cap markets folks or, ex-traders, people quants, a lot of quants in the community. Hester Peirce, who many of you may be familiar with, is an SEC commissioner. And Hester Peirce argues for something that we in the GDF community believe in firmly, which is, in the U.S. context, the U.S. capital markets are a treasure. We need to find a way to make sure that everyone in society can access them. And I think that's an important point, even on controversial things happening outside of crypto, meme stocks, GameStop, people who don't have money in many cases, which I'd offer may be different to the demography here, take higher risks than maybe we would in our defined pension, defined benefit, defined contribution pension schemes. People who have much less money, in fact, speculate in many ways on binary options and all sorts of platforms that have been available long before, crypto came along. So I just like to bear that in mind because we keep getting back to social utility. Hester Peirce, though, said something more important that rhymes with Caroline's point to me, particularly in the context of a Bitcoin ETF in the US, which is we seem to provide a greater level of scrutiny for this technology than we would for any other product. And so I think that's important to bear in mind. And then you say, well, Lawrence, you would say this because you're in the advocacy space and you spend time trying to advocate for the industry and make your case for things. But that is my job. This is the Bugs Bunny cartoon of Ralph and Sam the sheepdog and, the coyote trying to steal sheep here. We go to work every morning and we sit on opposite sides of the table, but we're trying to find a middle space. And so I think the importance to this for me in this context is the middle space is convening. OECD is a home for me. Greg Medcraft, who you're familiar with, GDF was actually almost found here for the most part before the policy forum was developed in its first year. And Greg Medcraft, who needs no introduction here, who left the OECD last year, is now on our board and is actually a mentor of mine, I think a leader in this space of convening. So, with some of the things and the tools we've been speaking about, what's the most important thing right now while we have all of these macro issues, which frankly, I am from TradFi and from the institutional space. I would say throughout my career now, and I'm in broadly what I would call the fourth, volatile black swan moment that we're having in life, there's a lot of room for improvement in our traditional markets, whether it's AML in, cash bearer instruments, right through to how we, manage risks in wholesale markets. So I think we should recognize that. But on the convening power, the power of bringing everyone together, and I think as most of us have spoken about, we call it a co-reg model, but finding a safe space for policymakers, lawmakers, and regulators to work with innovators where, they're not going to be held to account, there aren't going to be lawsuits, people can openly speak about how it is we can improve incrementally some of the things and some of the issues we have going is the most important tool of it all. And I think most of us would agree with this. This is where the OECD is certainly, leader and an inspiration from tax right through to blockchain. And it is global. This isn't a US or European problem. It isn't an Asian problem. These are global problems. And I know that you all would recognize this. And I'd just like to finish with this particular point. I had the privilege of spending a week with Greg and my GDF board in Washington 2 weeks ago, just as Chair Gensler and Chair Benham were up in front of the Banking and Senate Committee, respectively, just as the President's EO dropped on the week. We spent quite a bit of time with policymakers on both sides of the House on the Hill, and regulators and all of our friends at the SEC and the CFTC who have been in our own GDF reg forum for 5 years and who have purview of what we do and are really working with us in the community to try to get better standards. But what I would say is this, that the community, and it's not just our crypto community that Caroline and I live in, the digital assets community, the blockchain community, we're often talking about designing better mousetraps. And I recognize that from capital markets, from designing complex structured products. We're always talking about very incremental things. And I think in this instance, given the macro situation we find ourselves in, particularly with inflation, which I just think, not to mention energy crisis in Europe, which is really bothering me given my own energy costs, to heat my house. But this is a really good time for us now to reflect and say, and in the Clay Christensen context, what job are we trying to do with all of this new technology for society? What are we really trying to solve here? Rather than arguing and saying, well, do you know what? All of this crypto and digital asset stuff, it's got so many problems with it. It'll take us years to actually break through with things. I mean, if we'd taken that approach to the combustion engine, I think we'd still be on horses. So I think if we can find some better way to have a mature discussion, particularly with policymakers here, because I have empathy with regulators who quite often have very narrow constraints and are waiting for policymakers and guidance here. So we lift our game and start talking about ultimately what utility is this sort of technology and is digital trying to help us with. And, I would hope it's at the top of all of our agendas, which is greater financial inclusion, distribution of wealth, access to markets, opportunity, and a greener and hopefully more climate-adjusted world, because I know that that's what most people here are really focused on. Thanks.
Thank you. So now, Caroline, may I ask again the question? What do you think policymakers should do or could do about it?
So I think what we're seeing, and perhaps bringing it back to the specific area of DeFi for this conversation, is we're seeing a very rapid acceleration. I think from a policy perspective, in terms of trying to find solutions, we thought we had time. When we think about MICA, for example, the idea was, okay, well, we'll leave DeFi, we'll come back. We'll come back to that in the second round. If we look at Australia, when they brought out their public consultation earlier this year, it very clearly stated, DeFi is out, like TBC in the future. If we think about IOSCO, for example, it's come out and said, they brought out an earlier paper this year, and then they sort of said, oh, look, we'll be doing some more work, come back and see us at the end of 2023. But we've seen a number of events which mean that these questions that we thought we had time to think about, and we'd sort of see where the market develops, are actually coming to us right now. And I think I'm thinking in particular about things like Tornado Cash, which was obviously a big shift in terms of how we thought about applying regulations, in this particular case sanctions rules, to a decentralised mixer like Tornado Cash. But we're also seeing it not just that. I think that's probably the most prominent example, which just raises this question of, well, who's responsible? Who's behind? Who actually has this obligation? Who can we create this hook? And how do you do that when you have a decentralised protocol in play? But we're also seeing other things. We've seen some litigation just in the last week after the Ethereum merge, which had a very clear statement from the SEC, which said that, because the largest group of validator nodes after the merge are now in the US, that gives jurisdiction. So this question of jurisdictional nexus for a distributed system. What is the right jurisdictional question? Is it a question of where your validator nodes, or is it something else? We've got another piece of litigation just this week, which is about, if you have been involved in a piece, in a particular DAO, then you're being asked to sort of show cause, and if not, judgment will be entered against you again in the US. And so sort of people having to make this question, well, what's the right, what sort of role have I had in this DAO? And do I sort of need to do anything in this space? And I think, so these questions about sort of who is responsible, and and I think, Nadia and yourself, Mathilde, have mentioned this a couple of times, borderless world, this question of jurisdictional nexus on distributed systems, those questions are coming to us right now. So while we thought we had time, I think the onus is very much on industry and policymakers to really try and, kind of nut through these questions together as much as we can, because the sort of implications of not doing anything are now actually being realised.
Thank you. So we have even more pressure. Not only it's difficult, but it's urgent. So, Nadia.
I will put one put of pressure more, okay. I think. No, I was agree with what we said before, and I think one of the thing that now the policymaker need to look at and to do, it's that in the beginning of all of that, we are looking about crypto and Bitcoin, okay? And after there is what are the usage on blockchain and DLT, and there is the point of decentralized identity, and there is the thing after we saw the stable coins, the CBDC, DeFi, CeFi, DeFi, CDFi, etc. And so yes, there is a number of concepts. I think the point is that, and it's complicated and it's complex, sorry, and it's really fractal. It's now the policymaker need to work together in the different specialty, finance, cyber, identity, and everything, because all begin to be integrated. We saw that in DeFi, we need to verify your identity, okay? You need to do all the check on the compliance. We need also to see what are the rules in finance, how we work on interoperability, because you can have transaction on a chain, transaction on another chain. You can have TradFi with what we are doing with the digital asset. If the security is on the TradFi and also on the DeFi. So all that points are real challenges for the policymaker. I said that it will be not less simple, my answer. And I think it's really important to try to work on that. For example, I don't know if you remember the Libra. And I was very surprised, and I know that I asked to some people here in France what they are working on the subject, but at the first presentation on Libra, I remember one here in France, Libra was not only a stablecoin project, it was an identity project and a stablecoin project. So, and when we are looking at the project on CBDC, we need to understand that there is a link. We are talking about digital transformation, transaction on the web, Web 2, Web 3, and all that is really linked. So I think it's a kind of thing that the policymaker need to look on. It's why I saw how we work now with the GAB on INADBA. We began to make the link on the different group, and it's something difficult. I think will take time because we don't have the standards, we don't have all the technology and the regulation, but it's really important, and we know how it's the difficulty to put a taxonomy on crypto. And we just finished MiCA, but we need to know what we do with NFT, what we do with DeFi, and blah blah. So it's a point that we need to look at, I think.
Thank you. Now we have 5 minutes left, so if you could be not too long, so that we have time for each of you to have a final message to policymakers.
Yes. So maybe I will just include both that at the same time. So being very short, like I want to make a distinction, another distinction between. So most blockchain systems, they have a need for immutability, of course, in order to create confidence, but they also at the same time have increasingly a need for governability, meaning that you want to be able in specific circumstances to make the system evolve, potentially to cancel a transaction if that was a fraudulent transaction, or if it was just a mistake, and so forth. And so, especially when we think about like the adoption of blockchain-based system by institution, private or public, it becomes increasingly important that this governability exists. And of course, this governability reduces confidence and increase trust, because all of a sudden you need to trust the people that have the power over the governance. And so, what's interesting is that today, I think the viable blockchain system are the ones that manage to implement this proper mix between immutability, meaning like sufficient degree of decentralization so that no one can unilaterally modify anything, but maintaining a particular degree of governability so that things can evolve and things can change or can be repaired if anything breaks. And from like a regulatory or policy making perspective, it is very interesting because of course governability also implies regulability. Right? Because all of a sudden it means that if there are people that can govern the system, then we can regulate those people in order to regulate the system. And while it is difficult to regulate directly the technology, and probably like no one wants to regulate the technology as such, but you want to regulate the various uses and the various actors interacting with the technology. And then indeed we are seeing, like with the Tornado Cash, with the liability of DAO members, etc. We can see how as soon as we can identify those actors, then we can also impose some form of liability, which will somehow affect the way in which they act. And somehow this type of regulation is interesting, but it also has a potential collateral effect, which is all of a sudden, it kind of like it enacts this going dark debate where systems actually are increasingly choosing immutability over governability in order to escape from regulation. And we are seeing this with like all the, Tornado Cash to begin with, or like DAOs that are actually trying to be as programmatic as possible, because people are afraid that if they can control it, then they can also be held liable for that. And so there is this kind of like from a regulator and policymaker perspective, there is obviously a need to regulate and identifying the people that are the governor are the obvious subject of regulation. But at the same time, this create like this system that might actually go against them because all of a sudden technology become more decentralized, more immutable, and even more hard to regulate. And so to answer the second question, I think my invitation to policymakers in particular is really to try and find a way to bridge those worlds instead of trying to separate them more. And we don't want a system in which you have like institutional uses of blockchain technology which are super regulated, and then the dark market of blockchain that is very hard to regulate. Quite to the opposite, I think there is a value in like creating a bridge and actually not thinking about institutional and Web3 space, but actually finding a combination and an interaction between the two. And in order to do that, and I think this is the missing link into achieving that, is there needs to be more legal recognition of existing blockchain-based structures and systems. And again, and I will repeat it once again because I think it's super important, I believe that from a policymaker perspective, the best way of actually creating this bridge is to invite the private sector to discover ways in which to comply with the law and recognize that and create this constant discussion between blockchain-based systems that try to find solutions to say, hey, look, I want to be compliant, but I want to be compliant under my own terms because this is how the technology operates, and regulators trying to understand whether this is indeed legitimate, whether this is indeed compliant with the policy objective, and therefore helping both institutions adopt this technology because now they can adopt it because they understand it and they benefit from adopting it because they might benefit from a lesser regulatory burden, and at the same time also helping Web3 systems actually transition themselves towards a more institutionalized settings because they finally can interact and interface with that systems.
Thank you, Primavera. It's a very important message, like this bridging. No, Caroline, your last maybe like two sentences. What should we do urgently? I understood.
Yeah. So look, I love this idea of carrots, of incentives to attract into the sort of regulatory framework, but with sufficient flexibility that allows the kind of innovation to take first and foremost place. And I think that's the kind of key message for me is for policymakers is the investment in innovation, in regtech and in subtech, which invites this space in rather than and kind of pushes it out.
Thank you, Caroline. Laurence?
The message to policymakers is the future is here right now with digital, and it is going to help you solve your problems with inflation, food supply chain issues in general, and better equality in retail and wholesale financial markets. So invest, and the incentives and the sticks and carrots here are all about getting particularly the venture capital and private equity markets to invest in that. And you're investing in decentralized blockchain and DLT infrastructure for the next generation in partnership with industry. And you're doing it not just with industry and academia, but with industry associations and agencies who are the adults in the room who can help moderate and accelerate that.
Thank you, Laurence. Nadia?
I want to do that, to say that the Web3 revolution is a revolution. We are living in something that the digital transformation is going from information to transfer of value. In a global model, decentralized model, and I think it's important that the policymaker look at the thing more simply, perhaps, and to let the innovation be creative and be careful to don't complexify the thing and let the thing could have an evolution quickly, because the things are going quickly. The things are not finished, so we need to be more open on those subjects.
Thank you very much. I would not dare to summarize because it was a very rich conversation. But as apparently an adult in the room, I understood that we need to act very quickly. We need to invest. I mean, not only the policymakers, the regulators, but the private sector need to invest in RegTech and subtech solutions, creating these bridges so that we have regulatory equivalence and somehow using the very characteristics of this technology to find solutions that would be not that costly. So thank you very much, all of you. Of course, it was a very crude summary. We'll listen to everything you have told us and try to do a proper summary of all your thoughts and advice. Thank you very much. It was a fascinating conversation. Please join me.
Thank you, Mathilde.